Welcome back, everybody. Another episode of 10-Minute Theology. We've been talking about angels. Angels Part 8 today. Last time we talked about the Seraphim. Today we're going to talk about their partners, the Cherubim. See what that's all about. See what we can discover from the Word of God. So let's go ahead and jump right in and we will take a look at the text for today. All right, so as we think about cherubim, and start to talk about them and everything that is involved. First of all, it's interesting is again, the purpose of angels are to praise and serve God, which also can include serving mankind. If you go back and look at the previous episodes, linked, of course, in the description below, you can check out and catch up on all of that. But we want to focus on the cherubim because last time we did the seraphim. So let's go ahead and take a look at what we know about them from the text. So for starters, cherub is singular, cherubim is plural. Okay, now it's interesting when you look up the Hebrew word, and you always want to use multiple sources as you do this, but the meaning is debated out there, and several of the resources I looked at even specifically talk about that the root meaning of the Hebrew word is unclear, some put it. So to be near is a possibility. Great or mighty is another. Sometimes it can be both, depending on the context, all of that. So these were the two main definitions that I gleaned from the sources that I had and was looking at, okay? Interesting to know, mentioned a whole lot more times than the seraphim. If you remember with the seraphim, right, they only appear directly mentioned in Isaiah 6. Now, with the cherubim, the word actually for cherubim occurs 92 times in 68 verses, at least in the New American Standard, right? Most versions will be about the same. And that's in relation to heavenly beings. So it does appear two other times, not in relation to heavenly beings, but you can kind of go track that down if you want to. But regardless, 92 times in 68 verses. And I'll be honest with you, the majority of those times are just mentioned by name. So it'll mention cherub, it'll mention cherubim, but we don't get a lot of detail exactly about what they are. When you get into the descriptions of the tabernacle and how they were building it, and the temple as well, which we'll see as we go through some of the text today, a whole lot of references to cherub or cherubim, and that they were supposed to create images of them both in the curtains, on carvings on the walls, and then, of course, images made out of gold. But interesting to notice, boy, we encounter the cherubim quickly, and we first encountered them in the garden. So that's one of the first verses. In fact, the first verse that we'll be looking at today in regards to the cherubim. But a quick summary of them, right up front, they appear to be guardians. Throne bearers, divine attendants in God's presence is the way that I've heard people put it as well. So let's go ahead and jump into some of the text and take a look. So starting at the beginning with, almost at the beginning, a couple chapters after the beginning, Genesis chapter 3. So remember Adam and Eve's sin within Genesis chapter 3. So the first sin occurs. We see the fall of man and also the fall, the impact that the sin has on the world as well. But not only that, they're kicked out of the garden. So you see here in verse 24, so he being God, drove the man out, and at the east of the Garden of Eden, he stationed the cherubim and the flaming sword, which turned every direction to guard the way to the tree of life. It's quite a picture when you think about it, right? And you see, why was it positioned there? To guard the way to the tree of life. Because remember, there were two trees in the center of garden. There was a tree of knowledge of good and evil, which they were not supposed to take from, and they did, unfortunately. And so we're all sad because of that. But also the tree of life. So the cherubim were stationed there and the flaming sword. Interesting, isn't it? To block the way so that Adam and Eve and their offspring could not get back to the tree of life. Take it, eat from it, and live forever. Interesting when you think about it. And people will say today, well, wait a minute, so can't we go find the cherubim still guarding the tree of life today? Well, no, and don't forget, fast forward to Genesis chapter 6, and we're introduced to Noah, and then on through 7, 8, 9, and 10, right? We read about the flood. Flood comes, destroys the earth. So by default, the Garden of Eden would have been destroyed as well. Therefore, no more need for the cherubim to guard it because it's gone. So anyway, let's move on. That at least gives us our first instance of the cherubim, knowing that, hey, they're put there by God. There's some sort of supernatural being, probably. It doesn't specifically say here, right? But regardless, it's guarding the tree of life. So again, the role of the guardian here. All right, so let's go take a look in Exodus. So, Exodus 25, and we get our first description of what the cherubim may look like. At least it gives somewhat of a description to us, so that we can know. So, again, here, I'm talking about, so this is in preparation for the building of the tabernacle. But here they're building the Ark of the Covenant. So, which, of course, first of all, resides in the tabernacle before it makes its way to the temple in the time of Solomon. But let's take a look here at Exodus 25, verses 18 through 22, because we get a description here, at least some detail about what God wants them to do in terms of fashioning this in the Ark of the Covenant. So starting in verse 18, you shall make 2 cherubim of gold, make them of hammered work at the 2 ends of the mercy seat. Make 1 cherub at one end and 1 cherub at the other end. You shall make the cherubim of one piece, with the mercy seat and all its 2 ends. The cherubim shall have their wings spread upward, covering the mercy seat with their wings and facing one another. The faces of the cherubim are to be turned toward the mercy seat. You shall put the mercy seat on top of the ark, and in the ark you shall put the testimony which I give to you. There I will meet with you, and from above the mercy seat, from between the 2 cherubim, which are upon the ark of the testimony, or covenant, I will speak to you about all that I will give you in commandment for the sons of Israel. So we have this depiction here of the Ark of the Covenant, and they're talking about the lid of it that they're building here, fashioned from one piece of gold. That had to have been quite difficult, I would think, for the craftsman to make all of that, and with the likenesses of them. But you wonder here, right? It's like, how did they know what to make the cherubim look like? We know that they have wings. They're very specific about where the wings, how they need to be facing, and their faces. So that's kind of interesting. But other than that, it doesn't give us a whole lot of description, other than that we're introduced here to an instance of a supernatural being having wings, which is pretty cool and interesting to think about. So this is a fascinating site too, and if you've heard of the Temple Institute, you could go check them out at templeinstitute.org, and they have, you can actually take a virtual tour of the temple, which of course doesn't exist at this time, but the Temple Institute exists for the purpose of rebuilding the temple in Israel. So you can go read about that, check it out at templeinstitute.org. You see the link below where I got the image here, but this is one of the images that they have on their site, in what their depiction they believe would be of the seraphim sitting on top, the cherubim sitting on top of the Ark of the Covenant. So kind of interesting to see based on the description from Exodus 25 there. Now, this is entertaining too. So this is actually the actual, this is a picture of the prop that was used in the movie The Raiders of the Lost Ark. And you can see the link down there below as well to where I got that image. But regardless, you see at the top that they did have the cherubim. Notice their wings are touching. They are facing each other. There is something that they definitely missed. They got wrong in this, which you would expect, I guess, with a secular movie. Still very cool looking and impressive looking, right? But we'll in one of the next images here, I'll bring up what they got wrong here. And it has to do with which way the poles, the carrying poles that would slide into the ark, which way they actually faced. So you can see how they face here. Even though they don't show the poles, you can see the loops there that they would have gone through to be able to pick it up and carry it. But yeah, that is not the way the actual Ark of the Covenant was, which is kind of fascinating, really. Okay, so more descriptions of the cherubim. Again, if we go now take a look, and now in 1 Kings 6, so here we're getting down to their fashioning these for the actual, for the temple itself. Okay, so the building of the temple under Solomon. Let's go take a look at this text, because it gives us some more descriptions of the cherubim themselves. So starting in verse 23 in 1 Kings chapter 6. Also in the inner sanctuary he made 2 cherubim of olive wood, each 10 cubits high. 5 cubits was from one wing of the cherub, and 5 cubits the other wing of the cherub. From the end of one wing to the end of the other wing were 10 cubits. The other cherub was 10 cubits. Both the cherubim were of the same measure in the same form. The height of the one cherub was 10 cubits, and so was the other cherub. He placed the cherubim in the midst of the inner house, and the wings of the cherubim were spread out so that the wing of one was touching the one wall, and the wing of the other cherub was touching the other wall. So their wings were touching each other in the center of the house. He also overlaid the cherubim with gold. So again, a detailed description here. Again, these are images that were within the inner room, so within the Holy of Holies itself, which they were only allowed to go into once a year. Here you see a picture from the Temple Institute as well. I'm not sure who did the artwork, but again, there is the source to it if you want to go check it out. But regardless of that, you'll see in the middle there that there is the Ark of the Covenant. And notice how you see the support rods that you would carry it with sticking through. They actually go through the short sides of it on the outside, not down the long length of the ark. So that's one thing that the movie did not get right. But you see here a depiction where these huge creatures, so these huge cherubim, the images of them that are on either side of the Ark of the Covenant, again, their wings are covering that ark as well, which is a pretty interesting depiction. One thing I do notice here, and we'll mention this again when we hit the section in Ezekiel here in a couple slides, but notice that the artist here has depicted the cherubim with 6 wings. Okay, so keep that in mind. The picture here shows 6 wings. That's just the way they depicted it. I don't know who the artist is. Pretty cool looking picture. Regardless of that, let's go ahead and go to the next one here and take a look at what we have in Ezekiel. So Ezekiel, both chapter 1 and chapter 10 probably gives us the best description. In fact, it does. The best descriptions we have of the cherubim and what they physically looked like. So it kind of builds on some of the other things. We know so far that they have wings, but now when we get to Ezekiel, we get, quite a detailed picture. So let's take a look, and we're going to read 3 through 16 here, even though it's a decent little section, but I think it's important to take a look. Starting at verse 3 in chapter 1 of Ezekiel. The word of the Lord came expressly to Ezekiel the priest, son of Buzi, in the land of the Chaldeans by the river Chebar, and there the hand of the Lord came upon him. As I looked, behold, a storm wind was coming from the north, a great cloud with fire flashing forth continually, and a bright light around it, and in the midst something like glowing metal in the midst of the fire. Within it there were figures resembling 4 living beings, and this was their appearance. They had human form. Each of them had 4 faces and 4 wings. Their legs were straight, and their feet were like a calf's hoof, and they gleamed like burnished bronze. Under the wings of the 4 sides were human hands. As for the faces and the wings of the 4 of them, their wings touched one another. Their faces did not turn when they moved. Each went straight forward. As for the form of their faces, each had a face of a man. All 4 had the face of a lion on the right and the face of a bull on the left, and all 4 had the face of an eagle. Such were their faces. Their wings were spread out above. Each had 2 touching another being and 2 covering their bodies. Each went straight forward wherever the Spirit was about to go. They would go without turning as they went. In the midst of the living beings, there was something that looked like burning coals of fire, like torches darting back and forth among the living beings. The fire was bright, and the lightning was flashing from the fire. And the living beings ran to and fro like bolts of lightning. Now as I looked at the living beings, behold, there was one wheel on the earth beside the living beings. For each of the 4 of them, the appearance of the wheels and their workmanship was like sparkling beryl. All 4 of them had the same form, their appearance and workmanship being as if one wheel were within another. So you see in here, it's fascinating as Ezekiel's getting this vision, he is struggling with able to describe what he's seeing in the spirit world. And that's a good thing to remember. You have a human being struggling to describe what he's seeing in the spirit world. So he does the best he can, right? We get some first of all, we find out that they have 4 wings. Okay, so they don't have 2. We find out that they have 4, which is fascinating. And if you remember back to the picture from the Temple Institute, they showed them having 6, which seemed more like a seraphim than a cherubim. So we know that cherubim have 4 wings. They have faces, 4 faces. One is a man, one is an ox. Some translations will say bull. So man, ox, or bull will say. One is an eagle, one is a lion. So fascinating there. And also that they had human hands under their wings. And feet like a calf's feet. So interesting, really, you hate to say it, a pretty bizarre description of them, right? We find out a little more as we move on. In Ezekiel 10, So Ezekiel 10, we're not going to do the whole chapter because basically the whole chapter talks about cherubim. And if you would look up do a search on the word cherub with an asterisk, which will give you cherub or cherubim, tremendous amount of hits on it within both chapter 1 and chapter 10 of Ezekiel. So anyway, let's take a look here at Ezekiel 10 and verse 14 because it's another description. So we start in verse 1, and in chapter 1. You notice also in chapter 1, it never called them cherubim. Okay, it talked about what he was seeing, what it was like, but it never specifically said these are cherub or cherubim. Okay, within chapter 10 now, we get that detail. And it's clear from chapter 10 that chapter 1 was also talking about the cherubim. So let's take a look. In verse 14 here in Ezekiel 10, and each one had 4 faces. The first face was the face of a cherub, the second face the face of a man, the third face of a lion, and the fourth the face of an eagle. And that's in verse 14 in chapter 10. Now you go, well, wait a minute. In chapter 1, it said that there was a face of a man, face of a bull or an ox, depending on what translation you have, the face of a lion and the face of an eagle. Now it's saying the face of a cherub. What gives, right? All of a sudden it's changed to a cherub instead of before saying the face of an ox or a bull, depending on your translation. Don't forget that in ancient times and even now, right, a bull or an ox was a creature of extreme power. So by default, you are going to hear people describe things sometimes that are powerful that they're not exactly sure what they're looking at as an ox or a bull because it was just a creature of great power to them. Difficult to control, but once controlled, boy, great for especially to have an ox out in a farm, right, to be able to pull your plow, all the different type of stuff. So creature of great power. Now, once you get to chapter 10, it's no longer just the creature of great power, but now he's called it the cherub. So he has named it now a cherub as well and designated it that instead of just a creature of power. So don't let that get in your way and confuse you. And if you think he's not talking about the same creatures, boy, the Spirit of God helped us out, and it really emphasizes it throughout the rest of chapter 10. Look at verse 15, just the very next verse. Here, then the cherubim rose up. They are the living beings that I saw by the river Kebar. So you remember back in verse 3 of chapter 1 of Ezekiel, he talked about he was at the river Kebar. These are the living beings that he saw by that river. So the description that he's given in chapter 1 of the cherubim is indeed the cherubim, even though he doesn't call them cherubim back there. And if you're still not convinced, boy, look at verse 20. He says it again. These are the living beings that I saw beneath the God of Israel by the river Kebar. So I know they were cherubim. Each one had 4 faces. Each one had 4 wings. Beneath their wings was the form of human hands. And as for the likeness of their faces, this helps us too, they were the same faces whose appearances I had seen by the river Kebar. Each one went straight ahead. So again, yeah, he describes the faces a little bit, but he also says here they are the same faces. So we don't have to be concerned about the description of them being a little different. And we accept that, hey, the same thing that he saw in chapter 1 is what he's seeing here in chapter 10, which again, a fantastic description of cherubim. So based upon that, let's summarize it here, right? And exactly what they look like. So what do we know about the appearance of the cherubim from Ezekiel chapter 1 and chapter 10? We know they have 4 wings. We know they have human hands underneath their wings. We know they have feet like calves' hoofs. They have 4 faces: man, lion, bull, man and a lion, and then bull/ox/cherub, depending on which one you're looking at, and the eagle. And that they have eyes covering their whole body, backs, hands, and wings. You see that in chapter 10 as well, which I just didn't pull out. So again, you should really go back and read chapter 10 because it's quite a fascinating description of everything that's going on that Ezekiel's seeing. And boy, it mentions the cherubim a lot. So, I mean, as you look at this, you're like, wow, what's going on here? And by the way, what about the wheels, right? So it mentioned that there's these wheels below them. Okay, it's not part of them. It appears to be below them. But notice also the description back, I believe in chapter 1, where it talked about that the 4 wheels seem to be the same wheel. They seem to be combined, almost like the same wheel. I really think that what we're gleaning with from this is seeing Ezekiel looking into the spirit world, being shown the spirit world, which, keep in mind, is a dimension outside of ours. And if that's the case, you could be seeing these creatures that are partially in our dimension, partially outside of our dimension. I know it sounds kind of sci-fi, sounds a little bizarre, but yet it really makes sense when you start to look at that description, especially when we consider that he's going to be struggling with what he is seeing. Surely inspired by the word, by the Spirit of God to write down what he did in terms of the description within the Word of God. But yet, since we don't have that same reference and couldn't see it, he was struggling with describing it. And you see that same thing in the book of Revelation. If you go read through the entire book, right, and you see all the figurative language and the illusionist language and the comparison language that is in there, because John is just really confused, you can tell at times, about exactly what he is seeing. So he's trying his best to describe it. And I think we see some of that here. We're in the home stretch. Here's an interesting fact. Was Satan a cherub? Now we're going to do a whole section. We're getting ready to transition to that in a couple studies, over to demons, fallen angels, and of course Satan. So we'll be hitting all that there, but I kind of wanted to at least give you a little teaser trailer on that, right? Because in regards to Satan, most scholars think that Ezekiel 28 is talking about Satan. So it's talking about the king of Tyre. You can go take a look at that, but also it's a comparison that is done to Satan, because for starters, the king of Tyre was not in Eden. Okay, so in Ezekiel 28:13, we read, "You were in Eden, the garden of God." Then it goes on to give a bunch of descriptions at the end of that verse. Then you jump to verses 14 and 15 in Ezekiel 28, and it says, "You were the anointed cherub who covers, and I placed you there. You were on the holy mountain of God. You walked in the midst of the stones of fire. You were blameless in all your ways from the day you were created until unrighteousness was found in you." And then, of course, he was cast out. So we got a couple options here. Option one is that Satan was a cherub, and this is describing him because we know that he was blameless in ways until the day unrighteousness was found in him and he was cast out. We know Satan was in the garden of God. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Go read about it in chapter 3. If this isn't talking about Satan, it's some other angelic creature as well who had a very lofty position who also was cast out. A lot of conservative scholars go back to the fact that this is indeed talking about Satan, like I said, which we will get more to as we progress through the series further. So, quick summary of cherubim. What do we know? They appear in multiple contexts. So we see that they're guarding Eden. Again, that goes back to the idea that they're guardians, right? They're on the Ark of the Covenant, so they're guardians. They're in the presence of God. From that perspective, they're in the temple as well. So again, that they're in that, in that presence of God, almost as a servant of God, taking care of him. Not that he needs taking care of, but yet it's a representation of God's power, not figuratively because they're real creatures that are there, but as God has created them to show his power. And again, the fact that they're throne bearers, we see in Ezekiel 1, in chapter 1 and chapter 10. Also, Psalm 18:10, we didn't go look at today. It's one verse, but go take a look at it. It appears that the cherubim as well are escorts. So again, throne bearers escorting God. So fascinating when you go look at that verse. But just for the brevity of time, I eliminated it. You can kind of go check it out yourself. And of course, there's that possible connection to Satan in Ezekiel 28. Now, one last thing to leave you with. What about Revelation 4? So last time when we were talking about seraphim, we went to Revelation 4 and said, hey, there could be an illusion of the seraphim in Revelation 4. We could say the same thing here as we look at, sorry about that, bumped the wrong button, as we look at Revelation 4 in regards to the cherubim. So I'm not going to put the text up and show you. You can go check it out, read through Revelation 4, compare what you know about the cherubim and the seraphim, but summarize it for you real quick. It doesn't say in Revelation chapter 4 that they are a cherubim or a seraphim. So that's, for starters, it doesn't call that out. And it almost, when you read the description, it almost sounds like they could be a hybrid. For starters, they have 6 wings, like the seraphim. Okay, the cherubim, we're told that they have 4 wings. But yet they have 4 faces, like the cherubim, which we're not told that the seraphim have 4 faces. But we'll also read that it's full of eyes, like the cherubim as well. So it refers to them as living creatures. We see the cherubim are referred to as living creatures, and we see that same type of allusion with the seraphim. So is it a hybrid of the two? Is it really seraphim, and it's just giving us an extra definition of what the seraphim look like more? So maybe they look closer to the cherubim than we realize. It's hard to say. And there's really no way to know. But this is also one reason why some scholars will say that there is no difference between cherubim and cherubim. They're actually the same creatures, just different depictions of them. I personally do not believe that. I believe that they are separate creatures. But yet you come to Revelation 4, and it really appears like it's either more description of the seraphim or some totally different hybrid creature between the two, a totally different angelic being, heavenly creature in God's throne room as well. We don't know. Perhaps we'll never figure it out on this side of eternity. Once we get there, hey, we'll ask him, and perhaps, in fact, we know we probably will, right? We'll see them in the throne room of God ourselves. And maybe we can walk up and say, hey, which are you? Seraphim or cherubim? Regardless of that, it brings us to another conclusion of another 10-minute theology episode. Angels Part 8. What are the cherubim and the seraphim? We hit them pretty good this time. I hope you enjoyed it. A lot of stuff, a lot of information. Again, check it out again, watch it again, whole lot of information, follow along, go look up some of the resources I showed you as well. I pray you're doing great. I hope you have a fantastic week. Go out and serve our Lord Jesus Christ this week, and take care, everybody.